There is a kind of sensitivity that feels like a curse disguised as a gift. To feel deeply is to know the world in a way that others do not. To sense the subtle shifts in a room's emotional temperature. To know when someone is hurting before they speak. To absorb not just the words people say, but the pain beneath them. This is empathy. And for those who feel it acutely, it is both a superpower and a slow-moving tragedy. A highly sensitive person walks through a world that was not built for their sensitivity. They are surrounded by people who do not feel as much, who do not notice what they notice, who move through suffering without being fundamentally changed by it, and so the sensitive person becomes the container, the listener, the one who carries others' pain as though it is their own, because to them it is. But there is a cost to this. A cost that accumulates silently, invisibly, until one day, the person who has given so much of their empathy discovers they have nothing left. The sensitivity that was meant to connect them to the world has isolated them. The gift of feeling deeply has become the burden of feeling everything. This is the story of what happens when empathy becomes exhaustion. This is the story of the dark side of feeling too much in a world that feels too little. Chapter 1. Recognition, emotional beginning. A person walks into a room and feels the room before they see it. There is a tension between two people that no one else seems to notice. A sadness beneath someone's smile that most would miss. A rage held in another's shoulders that appears invisible to everyone but them. The highly sensitive person sees all of this, and they feel all of it. They carry it the way other people carry groceries. It becomes their burden, not because anyone asked them to carry it, but because they cannot help it. Their nervous system is wired to absorb, to sense, to feel, and so they do, whether they want to or not. This person has probably heard their entire life that they are too sensitive, that they need to toughen up, that they feel too much. And they have spent years trying to do this, trying to develop a thicker skin, trying to let things roll off them, trying to be like the other people, the ones who do not cry at movies, who do not feel exhausted after being around emotional people, who do not know what it is like to absorb someone else's grief as though it is their own. But they have failed because they cannot turn off their empathy any more than they can turn off their heart. And so they have become the person people confide in, the person who knows when something is wrong even before they are told, the person who can sit with someone's pain without flinching, the person who understands without explanation what someone needs. The world sees this as a gift, and sometimes it is. But more often, it is a slow-moving tragedy. The sensitive person knows things about the people around them that those people do not want known. They can feel the marriage strain beneath the surface. They can sense the depression hiding behind the competence. They can detect the loneliness masked by activity, and they carry all of this. They worry about it, they lose sleep over it, they absorb it into their own nervous system until they cannot distinguish between their own pain and everyone else's. There is an exhaustion in this, a deep exhaustion that sleep does not touch, a mental fatigue that comes from constantly processing other people's emotions, a kind of numbness that settles in when the sensitive person has absorbed so much pain that their own nervous system begins to shut down. And there is a loneliness in this too, because the sensitive person is often surrounded by people, friends who confide in them, family members who rely on them, colleagues who seek their support. But they are profoundly alone because they are always giving, they are always listening, they are always the strong one. And there is no one to hold them while they cry about the weight of all the feelings they carry. The sensitive person begins to resent the very empathy that was supposed to connect them to the world. Because their empathy has become a one-way street. They feel everyone else's pain deeply, but very few people feel theirs. Chapter 2. Root Cause Origins. The highly sensitive person was born this way. Science shows that about 15 to 20% of people are born with something called sensory processing sensitivity. They have more active mirror neuron systems. Their brains show increased activity in areas related to emotional and social processing. Their nervous systems are more reactive to stimuli. They literally process the world differently than others. This is not a defect. Evolution has kept this trait around in the human population for a reason. Highly sensitive people are often the ones who notice danger first. They are creative. They can learn deeply. They are capable of experiencing joy and beauty and connection in ways that others cannot access. But in a world that does not value sensitivity, in a world that valorizes toughness and emotional distance and the ability to compartmentalize, being highly sensitive is a liability. And so the sensitive person learns to apologize for themselves. They learn that their feelings are too big, their reactions too extreme, their needs too demanding. They learn to hide, to suppress, to try to become less of what they are. But there is also something else that happens. The sensitive person learns, often implicitly, that their value lies in their empathy, that the way they are useful, the way they matter, is through their ability to hold others' pain. So they lean into this. They become the therapist, the counselor, the friend people call at 3 a.m., the person who always knows what to say. And gradually, they lose themselves in the service of this role. They begin to identify so strongly with being the helper, the healer, the empath, that they forget they are also allowed to need. There is also the matter of how they were raised. Many highly sensitive people grew up with a parent who had their own emotional difficulties. A parent who was overwhelmed or depressed or unable to regulate their own emotions. And the sensitive child learned to attune to that parent, to sense when the parent was about to break, to try to manage the parent's emotions, to make themselves small when the parent needed space, to take care of the parent's feelings because no one was taking care of the sensitive child's. This creates a lifelong pattern. The sensitive person becomes conditioned to prioritize others' emotional needs over their own. They become hyper-vigilant to others' suffering. They become addicted to the role of helper because that is the only role in which they learned they had value. Chapter 3. Scientific psychological explanation. When a person has high empathy, something specific happens in their brain. There are two types of empathy. Other-oriented empathy is the capacity to understand someone else's perspective and feel compassion for them. This type of empathy protects people from burnout. It allows them to care deeply without losing themselves. But there is also self-oriented empathy. This is when a person feels others' suffering so acutely that it becomes their own suffering, when their nervous system literally mirrors another person's nervous system. This is emotional contagion, and research shows that self-oriented empathy is directly correlated with compassion fatigue and burnout. When the highly sensitive person engages in self-oriented empathy, their brain shows increased activation in areas related to negative emotions. The mirror neuron system activates more strongly, creating a stronger mirroring of the other person's emotional state. The person does not just understand suffering, they absorb it. And this absorption drains the dopamine system, leading to numbness, hopelessness, and exhaustion. Over time, with repeated exposure to others' suffering, the nervous system becomes dysregulated. The person is in a constant state of activation. The amygdala, the threat detection center, is always on. The vagus nerve, which regulates the parasympathetic nervous system, becomes strained. The person never fully rests, never fully recovers. Compassion fatigue is real. It is not philosophical or spiritual. It is a neurobiological response to prolonged exposure to suffering combined with the lack of ability to regulate one's own emotional responses. And research shows that the more empathic someone is, the higher their risk of developing compassion fatigue. There is a paradox here that is important to understand. Empathy is necessary for helping others, but too much empathy, without the ability to distinguish between one's own emotions and others' emotions, causes burnout. And when the person burns out, they can no longer help anyone, not themselves, not others. The highly sensitive person often does not know this distinction. They believe that their emotional absorption is proof of their care, that the deeper they feel, the better helper they are. But research shows the opposite. The people who are most helpful are those who can feel compassion for others while maintaining their own emotional boundaries, who can care without losing themselves. The highly sensitive person's brain is also more susceptible to global emotional exhaustion from exposure to widespread suffering. With 24/7 news cycles and the constant exposure to human suffering through media, the sensitive person is being asked to absorb unprecedented amounts of pain. Their nervous system was not evolved for this, and it breaks under the weight. Chapter 4: Inner Conflict Resistance. The sensitive person lives in an impossible contradiction. Part of them wants to disconnect, wants to not feel so much, wants to be like other people, who seem to move through the world unaffected by all the suffering around them, who can watch the news without absorbing it, who can be around someone in pain without carrying that pain home with them, who can say no without feeling guilty. But another part of them knows that if they disconnect, if they stop feeling, they will have lost the only thing that makes them feel alive. The sensitivity that exhausts them is also what allows them to experience beauty, to create, to love deeply, to understand others in ways that most people cannot. So they try to find a middle ground, and they fail, because there is no middle ground between empathy and numbness. You are either feeling or you are not. And the sensitive person who has spent their life learning that their value lies in their empathy cannot become numb without losing themselves. There is also a guilt that runs deep. Guilt about not being able to help more. Guilt about eventually withdrawing to protect themselves. Guilt about saying no to someone's need. Guilt about taking care of themselves when someone else is suffering. This guilt is often unspoken. It lives beneath the surface, but it drives much of what the sensitive person does. And there is anger. Anger at the world for being so full of suffering. Anger at other people for not feeling what they feel. Anger at themselves for feeling too much. Anger at the people they love for not understanding what it costs them to be so empathetic. But this anger is often turned inward, because expressing anger at others feels like a betrayal of the sensitivity that is supposed to make them good. The sensitive person also often finds themselves in relationships where they are the strong one, the helper, the one holding space for others. But they are profoundly weak, and this weakness is invisible. The partner, the friend, the family member does not see how much the sensitive person is struggling. They see only the support being given. And over time, the sensitive person becomes invisible. There is also resistance to admitting that their empathy has become a problem, because if they admit that their sensitivity is hurting them, then they have to do something about it. They have to set boundaries, they have to disappoint people, they have to stop being available 24/7. And the thought of doing this is terrifying. Chapter 5: Turning Point Realization. The breaking point comes when the sensitive person can no longer sustain the effort. Sometimes it is a complete collapse. The nervous system, exhausted from years of absorbing others' pain, simply shuts down. Depression sets in. Anxiety spikes. The person who was once so available becomes completely withdrawn, and in that withdrawal, everything that was suppressed comes up. Sometimes it is a relationship breaking. The person they love finally says, "You are not really here for me. You are here, but you are not present. You are with me, but you are somewhere else. And in that moment, the sensitive person realizes that their empathy, which was supposed to create connection, has created distance. Sometimes it comes through seeing the futility. The sensitive person spends years carrying others' pain, absorbing others' suffering, being the emotional support for everyone around them. And nothing changes. The people they support do not get better. The world does not become less painful. And they realize that their empathy was not helping anyone. It was just hurting them. Sometimes it comes through a moment of profound loneliness. The sensitive person is surrounded by people, but they have never felt more alone, because no one knows them. Everyone knows the version of them that listens, that supports, that holds space. But no one knows the person inside who is breaking, who is terrified, who cannot hold themselves together anymore. The turning point is when the sensitive person finally admits, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot feel this much. I cannot absorb this much pain. I cannot be everyone's emotional support. I cannot hold the world's suffering while I myself am breaking. And this admission is devastating because it means admitting that the empathy that they have organized their entire life around is destroying them. It means admitting that being the strong one has made them weak. It means admitting that they need help. And for someone who has spent their life helping others, asking for help feels impossible. But it is also liberating, because for the first time they give themselves permission to not feel everyone's pain, to not absorb everyone's emotions, to prioritize their own well-being. Chapter 6: Healing Integration. Healing for the sensitive person is not about becoming less empathetic. It is about learning the difference between empathy and emotional contagion, about learning to feel compassion for others without absorbing their emotional state into their own nervous system, about learning that they can care deeply while also protecting themselves. It looks like learning to distinguish between their own emotions and others' emotions. This is harder than it sounds for someone who has spent their life merging with others' emotional states. But with practice, with support, they begin to notice, this grief is not mine. This anxiety is not mine. This pain belongs to this other person. It looks like setting boundaries, and not just any boundaries, but boundaries that protect their nervous system. It might look like not answering the phone after a certain time. It might look like limiting their exposure to news or social media. It might look like saying no to people's requests for support when they themselves are depleted. It looks like building a life that includes their own joy, their own rest, their own pleasure, not as a luxury, not as something they earn through productivity, but as a necessary part of maintaining their own well-being. Because a sensitive person who is completely drained cannot help anyone. It looks like finding people who can reciprocate, who can listen to them the way they listen to others, who can hold their pain the way they hold others. This is perhaps the hardest part, because the sensitive person has often attracted people who need their empathy, and finding people who can give as much as they give requires them to change who they spend time with. It involves therapy, working with someone who understands sensitivity to help the sensitive person develop skills for emotional regulation, to help them learn to observe others' emotions without absorbing them, to help them practice saying no, to help them grieve the years spent in service to others. It involves recognizing that their sensitivity is not a flaw to fix, but a trait that needs to be lived with wisdom, that empathy is beautiful and valuable, but empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. Chapter 7: Poetic Closure Reflection. There is a particular kind of strength in a sensitive person who has learned to protect their own sensitivity. It is the strength of someone who can feel deeply while also knowing their limits, someone who can care profoundly while also taking care, someone who can absorb beauty and joy without also absorbing all the world's suffering. The sensitive person who is burned out and recovered often becomes someone even more valuable than before, because they have learned through their own pain the importance of boundaries. They have learned that empathy without protection is self-harm. They have learned that the most compassionate thing they can do is to compassionately protect themselves. The world needs sensitive people. We need people who can feel, who can sense when something is wrong, who can create and dream and love deeply. The tragedy is not that there are sensitive people. The tragedy is that we live in a world that does not know how to honor sensitivity. But the sensitive person can create that honoring for themselves. They can decide that their feelings matter, that their pain is worth attending to, that their need for rest and beauty and deep connection is not selfish but necessary. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you are someone who feels too much in a world that feels too little, know this: your sensitivity is not a curse. It is not something to overcome. It is something to protect. You do not need to become harder. You do not need to feel less. You need to feel more carefully. You need to distinguish between your pain and everyone else's pain. You need to learn that caring for yourself is not a betrayal of your empathy. It is the only way your empathy can sustain itself. The world will always have suffering. There will always be people in pain. And if you are someone who feels deeply, you will always be aware of that suffering. But you can be aware of it without absorbing it. You can care about it without destroying yourself. You can be sensitive to the world's pain while also being sensitive to your own need for protection. The sensitive person becomes whole not by becoming less sensitive, but by becoming wisely sensitive, by honoring the depth of their feeling while also honoring the necessity of their own wholeness. And in that wisdom, something beautiful happens. The empathy that once exhausted them becomes sustainable. The sensitivity that once isolated them becomes a bridge. The gift that almost broke them becomes the gift that heals them. And finally, at last, they can feel both the world's pain and their own capacity to be okay.